In a small, quiet town surrounded by endless fields of golden grass and rugged hills, life moved at its own slow pace. The sun rose early and set late, casting long shadows over the dirt roads and wooden fences that lined the countryside. This was Clara Bennett's world, a place where everyone knew each other and secrets were hard to keep. But for Clara, life wasn't as simple or peaceful as it seemed on the surface. Clara had taken over her family's ranch after her father passed away 2 years ago. It wasn't easy. Running a ranch required strength, patience, and more money than she currently had. Every day felt like a battle against time, weather, and debt collectors. Her hands were calloused from hours spent mending fences, feeding livestock, and fixing broken machinery. Despite the challenges, Clara refused to give up. This land was all she had left of her father, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. On one particularly hot summer evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Clara stood near the ranch gate, wiping sweat from her brow. She watched the horizon, where the road stretched out into the distance. Not many people came this way, especially not when the sun was setting. Most travelers preferred to arrive during daylight hours, when they could see clearly and avoid getting lost in the maze-like trails leading to her property. So when a figure appeared on horseback, silhouetted against the fading light, Clara couldn't help but feel curious and a little wary. The rider approached slowly, his chestnut mare plodding along with steady steps. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded most of his face, making it difficult to see his features. His clothes were dusty, worn, and patched in places, suggesting he'd been on the road for quite some time. As he drew closer, Clara noticed the sharp glint of his blue eyes beneath the brim of his hat. There was something about those eyes, something intense yet kind, that made her pause. "Evenin'," the man said in a low, gravelly voice as he reined in his horse beside the gate. "Mind if I trouble you for some water? My horse is thirsty." Clara hesitated for a moment. Strangers weren't uncommon in these parts, but they usually stopped in town first, before venturing out to isolated ranches like hers. Still, there was no harm in offering water. "Sure," she replied, pushing open the gate just enough for him to lead his horse inside. "There's a trough over there. Help yourself." The man tipped his hat slightly in thanks, then dismounted with practiced ease. He walked his horse to the trough, allowing the animal to drink deeply while he glanced around the property. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying everything, the barn, the corrals, even the house, though she couldn't guess why. When the horse finished drinking, the man turned back to her. "Much obliged," he said. "Name's Jack. Jack Callahan." "Clara Bennett," she replied, crossing her arms over her chest. "What brings you out here, Mr. Callahan?" Jack shrugged, leaning casually against the fence post. "Just passing through. Been riding for weeks. Thought I'd stop and stretch my legs before moving on." Clara nodded, though she didn't entirely believe him. Something about Jack felt off. Maybe it was the way he carried himself with confidence despite his shabby appearance, or maybe it was the fact that he hadn't mentioned where he was headed next. Either way, she decided to tread carefully. "Well, if you're hungry, I can offer you supper. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your belly." For a brief moment, Jack looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected such generosity. Then he smiled faintly, revealing a hint of warmth behind his otherwise guarded expression. "I won't say no to that," he said. As they sat down to eat later that evening, Clara tried to learn more about her unexpected guest. She asked questions about where he'd come from, what he did for work, and whether he had family waiting for him somewhere. Jack answered vaguely, speaking of towns she'd never heard of and jobs that sounded temporary at best. He claimed to be a drifter, someone who preferred the open road to settling down. "Easier that way," he said with a shrug. "No ties, no responsibilities." Despite his evasiveness, Clara found herself warming to him. There was a quiet charm about Jack that was hard to resist. He listened intently when she spoke, nodding thoughtfully as she shared stories about her father and the struggles she faced keeping the ranch afloat. Occasionally, he offered advice, how to patch a leaky roof, how to train a stubborn calf, but always in a way that felt helpful rather than intrusive. After dinner, as they sat outside watching the stars appear one by one, Clara realized she hadn't laughed or felt this relaxed in months. Jack had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and his observations about life on the road were both fascinating and oddly comforting. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. But even as she enjoyed his company, Clara couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that Jack wasn't telling her the whole truth. Who was this man, really? And why had he chosen her ranch as a place to rest? Little did she know Jack was wrestling with his own thoughts. He hadn't planned to stay this long, but there was something about Clara, her determination, her kindness, her refusal to give up, that stirred emotions he thought he'd buried long ago. As the night grew cooler, Jack excused himself, saying he'd sleep in the barn and be gone by morning. Clara nodded, grateful for his discretion. She didn't press him further, knowing instinctively that pushing too hard might drive him away. As she climbed into bed that night, she wondered if she'd ever see him again, or if he'd disappear into the wilderness like so many drifters before him. What neither of them realized was that their meeting wasn't just chance. Jack had been watching Clara from afar for weeks, drawn to her resilience and the way she poured her heart into the ranch. He'd debated approaching her, unsure if he should risk disrupting her life. Now, having spent an evening in her company, he was beginning to regret his decision to leave. But Jack had secrets, big ones, and revealing them would change everything. For now, he resolved to stick to his plan. Ride out at dawn and put as much distance between himself and Clara as possible. Yet, as he lay awake in the hayloft, staring at the rafters above, Jack couldn't shake the image of Clara's smile. It had been years since anyone had made him feel this way, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. One thing was certain, though. Leaving wouldn't be as easy as he'd hoped. The next morning, Clara woke up to the sound of hammering. At first, she thought it was just the wind rattling something loose on the barn, but as she stepped outside, she saw Jack perched on the roof of the old tool shed. His hat was pulled low, over his face, and he was nailing down a few loose shingles that had been threatening to fly off for months. Clara blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to stick around after saying he'd leave at dawn. "What are you doing?" she called out, shielding her eyes from the bright sunlight. Jack glanced down at her, his expression unreadable. "Fixin' your roof," he replied matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Can't have it caving in on you." Clara frowned, crossing her arms over her chest. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No, but it needed doing," Jack said simply, turning back to his work. "Besides, I ain't got anywhere urgent to be today." His casual tone irritated her, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. The shed had been leaking for weeks, and every time it rained, water pooled inside, ruining tools and feed sacks. Still, she wasn't used to people, especially strangers, just taking charge like this. "You don't have to stay and fix things for me," she said firmly. "I can manage." Jack paused mid-swing, looking down at her with those piercing blue eyes. "I'm sure you can," he said, his voice softer now. "But there's no harm in letting someone lend a hand once in a while." There was something about the way he said it, calm, steady, almost gentle, that made Clara hesitate. She wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need help, but deep down she knew she did. Between the endless chores, looming debts, and the weight of running the ranch alone, she often felt like she was drowning. Maybe letting Jack stick around for a little while wouldn't hurt. By midday, Jack had finished patching the roof and moved on to repairing a section of fence that had collapsed during a recent storm. Clara tried to focus on her own tasks, feeding the chickens, checking on the cattle, but she kept finding herself glancing over at him. He worked quickly and efficiently, his movements practiced and precise. It was clear he'd done this kind of labor before, though he never mentioned where or when. As the afternoon wore on, Clara decided to make lemonade and bring it out to him. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to do so. It wasn't like she owed him anything, but something about his quiet determination stirred a sense of gratitude in her. When she approached the fence line, Jack looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Thought you might be thirsty, Clara said, holding out a glass. Jack accepted it with a nod of thanks. Appreciate it. He took a long sip, then sighed contentedly. Nothing hits the spot like cold lemonade on a hot day. They stood there for a moment in companionable silence, watching the horizon stretch endlessly before them. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Jack tilted his head, considering her question. "Does there have to be a reason?" "Yes," Clara replied without hesitation. "Most folks don't go out of their way for strangers unless they want something." A ghost of a smile crossed Jack's lips. "Maybe I just like working with my hands. Or maybe I figure you've got enough on your plate without worrying about leaky roofs and broken fences." "That's not an answer," Clara pressed, narrowing her eyes. Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. "All right, fair enough. Truth is, I know what it's like to feel like the whole world's against you. Sometimes all a person needs is someone to say, 'Hey, I've got your back.' That's all this is." His words struck a chord in Clara, though she didn't fully understand why. There was a sadness behind them, a depth that hinted at experiences far beyond anything she'd faced. But before she could probe further, Jack changed the subject. "How long you been running this place by yourself?" he asked, leaning against the fence post. 2 years, Clara answered. "Ever since my dad passed?" Jack nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "That's tough, losing someone close to you. It leaves a hole nothing else can fill." Clara swallowed hard, surprised by how much his words resonated with her. She'd spent so long trying to appear strong, to convince herself she didn't need anyone, that she rarely allowed herself to think about the grief still lingering beneath the surface. Now, standing here with Jack, she felt a strange urge to open up, to share the burden she'd been carrying alone for so long. "It's not just losing him," she admitted quietly. "It's everything that came after. The bills, the repairs, the constant fear of failing him. I promised I'd take care of this ranch, but sometimes I wonder if I'm cut out for it." Jack studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said finally. "Anyone who can keep going when the odds are stacked against him deserves respect." Clara managed a small smile, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "Thanks. I guess hearing that helps, even if I don't always believe it." Over the next few days, Jack continued to pitch in wherever he could. He helped round up stray cattle, repaired a broken pump near the well, and even taught Clara a trick or two for handling stubborn horses. Each task brought them closer together, their conversations growing longer and more personal. Clara learned bits and pieces about Jack's past, how he'd traveled across the country, working odd jobs and living off the land. But whenever she asked about his family or where he called home, he deflected, steering the conversation back to her. Rumors began to spread in town about the mysterious cowboy who'd taken up residence at the Bennett Ranch. Some folks whispered that he was trouble, while others speculated he might be sweet on Clara. One particularly nosy neighbor, Mrs. Harper, cornered Clara at the general store one afternoon. "Heard you've got a new helper," Mrs. Harper said, her tone dripping with insinuation. "What's his story? Seems awfully interested in your affairs." Clara bristled at the implication. "He's just helping out, that's all. No ulterior motives." Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow. Well, you be careful, dear. Men like that, they come and go, and sometimes they leave behind more problems than solutions." Though Clara dismissed the warning, it planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Why was Jack sticking around? And why did he seem so reluctant to talk about himself? She pushed the thoughts aside, telling herself she was being paranoid. After all, he hadn't given her any reason to distrust him. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Clara decided to broach the subject. "You've been here almost a week now," she began hesitantly. "I appreciate everything you've done, but why haven't you moved on yet? You said you were just passing through." Jack tensed slightly, his jaw tightening. For a moment he didn't respond, staring out at the horizon as if searching for the right words. "Guess I've been enjoying the company," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "And maybe I see something worth staying for." Clara's heart skipped a beat, though she wasn't sure why. Was he talking about her? The ranch? Both? She opened her mouth to ask, but Jack spoke again before she could. "I won't overstay my welcome," he added quickly. "Just figured I'd stick around until you're back on solid ground." The sincerity in his voice reassured her, though questions still lingered in the back of her mind. Who was Jack Callahan really? And what secrets was he hiding beneath his calm, unassuming exterior? For now, Clara chose to let it go. Whatever his reasons, she couldn't deny that having him around made life easier, and somehow brighter. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Clara realized she hadn't felt this at ease in years. Jack's presence was comforting, like a steady anchor in the chaos of her life. But even as she grew to trust him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. The days turned into weeks, and Jack became a fixture at the ranch. Clara had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, his steady hands fixing what was broken, and his calming voice filling the silences that often hung heavy over the vast open land. He wasn't intrusive. Instead, he seemed to know exactly when to step in and when to give her space. Yet, despite his growing familiarity, there was still an air of mystery about him, a part of him that remained locked away, hidden from view. One afternoon, as Clara sat at the kitchen table sorting through bills, her stomach sank with each envelope she opened. The numbers didn't add up, again. No matter how hard she worked or how much Jack helped around the ranch, the debts kept piling up. She stared at the latest letter from the bank, her heart pounding in her chest. It was worse than she'd feared. They were threatening foreclosure if she didn't settle her outstanding balance within 30 days. 30 days? How could she possibly come up with that kind of money? Tears welled in her eyes as frustration and fear overwhelmed her. She clenched her fists, trying to hold herself together. But it was no use. A sob escaped her lips, followed by another. Before she knew it, she was crying uncontrollably, her head buried in her arms on the table. Jack, who had been outside working on the tractor, heard the muffled sounds coming from the house. Concerned, he walked in without knocking, only to find Clara slumped over the table, surrounded by papers. For a moment he froze, unsure of what to do. Then quietly, he pulled out a chair and sat down beside her. "Clara," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "What's wrong?" She looked up, startled, and quickly wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "It's nothing," she muttered, avoiding his gaze. "Just bills." Jack frowned, his sharp eyes scanning the scattered documents on the table. Without asking permission, he picked up the letter from the bank and read it. His jaw tightened as he absorbed the details. When he finally looked at Clara again, his expression was unreadable. "This isn't nothing," he said firmly. "This is serious." Clara sighed, feeling both embarrassed and defeated. "I know it's serious, but there's nothing I can do about it. I've tried everything, selling off cattle, cutting costs, even taking odd jobs in town. None of it's enough." Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He hated seeing her like this, so weighed down by burdens that shouldn't be hers alone to bear. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he could solve this problem with a single phone call, but he couldn't bring himself to reveal his secret. Not yet. Instead, he offered what little comfort he could. "You're not alone in this," he said gently. "We'll figure something out." Clara gave him a weak smile, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "Thanks, Jack. But unless you've got a magic wand, I don't see how." That night, after Clara had gone to bed, Jack stepped outside and made a discreet call to one of his lawyers. Using an alias, he instructed them to reach out to the bank on Clara's behalf, delaying the foreclosure process indefinitely. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would buy her some time to regroup and find a way forward. As he hung up the phone, he felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief because he'd managed to help her, and guilt because he'd done so under false pretenses. A few days later, Clara received a letter from the bank informing her that her case had been reviewed and her deadline extended by 6 months. She read the notice twice, convinced it was some kind of mistake. Banks didn't just change their minds like that, not without a reason. Suspicion gnawed at her, and her thoughts inevitably turned to Jack. She found him in the barn, oiling the saddle he used during his morning rides. "Did you have something to do with this?" she demanded, holding up the letter. Jack paused, his hands hovering over the leather. He hadn't expected her to confront him so soon, or at all. "What are you talking about?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "The bank," Clara said, her voice rising slightly. "They suddenly decided to give me more time. That doesn't happen unless someone pulls strings." "Did you talk to them?" Jack hesitated, caught between lying outright and revealing too much. "I might have mentioned your situation to a friend of mine," he admitted cautiously. "But it wasn't anything major, just making sure they understood how hard you're working to keep things afloat." Clara studied him closely, searching for signs of deception. "Why would they listen to you? You're just a drifter, Jack. No offense, but people like you don't usually have that kind of influence." Her words stung, though Jack knew she didn't mean them maliciously. Still, he couldn't deny the truth in what she said. People like him, the real him, didn't belong in her world. They existed behind closed doors, pulling levers and signing checks, while others lived their lives unaware. He forced a smile, hoping to deflect her scrutiny. "Maybe I'm better connected than I let on," he said lightly. "Either way, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you've got more time to sort things out." Clara shook her head, unconvinced. "It matters. To me, Jack. If you're hiding something, I deserve to know." Her insistence rattled him. He wanted to tell her everything. To explain that he wasn't just a drifter, that he owned half the land surrounding the town and had resources beyond her imagination. But he also knew that doing so would shatter the fragile trust they'd built. And worse, it might push her away for good. "I'm not hiding anything," he said finally, though the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. "I just want to help." Clara didn't respond right away. She stood there staring at him, her emotions warring within her. On one hand, she trusted Jack, or at least, she wanted to trust him. On the other hand, the nagging suspicion that he wasn't being entirely truthful refused to go away. Finally, she nodded curtly and turned to leave. "If you're lying to me, Jack," she called over her shoulder, "it's going to change everything." Her warning hung in the air long after she'd gone, leaving Jack to wrestle with his conscience. He knew he'd crossed a line, however well-intentioned his actions might have been. Worse, he realized he couldn't keep living this double life, not if he wanted to stay close to Clara. Yet walking away now felt impossible. He cared about her too much to abandon her, especially when she needed him most. Over the next few days, tension simmered between them. Clara avoided asking further questions, but her guarded demeanor made it clear she hadn't forgotten their conversation. Meanwhile, rumors in town reached a fever pitch. Mrs. Harper claimed to have seen Jack meeting with a sharply dressed man near the courthouse, fueling speculation that he was involved in some kind of scheme. Word eventually made its way back to Clara, reigniting her doubts. Determined to get answers, Clara decided to follow Jack the next time he left the ranch. Early one morning, she saddled her horse and trailed him at a safe distance, careful not to be seen. To her surprise, he rode straight into town and entered a building marked Law Offices. Her suspicions deepened. Why would a drifter need to consult with lawyers? Unless, by the time Jack returned to the ranch later that afternoon, Clara was waiting for him. Her arms were crossed and her expression was grim. "You went to see a lawyer today," she stated flatly. "Care to explain why?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but he hadn't expected it to feel so suffocating. "Clara, Don't lie to me again," she interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Who are you, really? Because I don't think you're just some cowboy passing through anymore." For a moment, Jack considered denying it all, spinning another half-truth to protect himself. But looking into Clara's eyes filled with hurt and confusion, he knew he couldn't keep pretending. Slowly he nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm not who I said I am." Clara waited, her breath caught in her throat. "Then who are you?" Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. "My name is Jack Callahan, and yes, I've been traveling for years, but I'm also, well, let's just say I own a lot of land around here, more than you probably realize. And I have the means to help you, if you'll let me." The confession hit Clara like a punch to the gut. She staggered back a step, struggling to process what he'd just said. "You own land around here?" she repeated faintly. "Yes," Jack admitted. "And I've been using my connections to delay the bank's foreclosure. I didn't want you to lose the ranch." Clara's mind raced. Everything clicked into place. The mysterious meetings, the sudden extension from the bank, the way he always seemed to know exactly what to do. Anger bubbled to the surface, hot and raw. "How dare you?" she snapped. "You lied to me, Jack. You meddled in my life without telling me the truth." "I was trying to protect you," Jack shot back, his own frustration spilling over. "Would you have accepted my help if you'd known the truth? Or would you have pushed me away like everyone else?" "That's not the point," Clara shouted. "The point is that you didn't trust me enough to be honest." Her words struck a nerve, and Jack fell silent, realizing she was right. He'd acted out of a desire to help, but in doing so, he'd undermined her trust. Now he feared he'd ruined any chance of earning it back. "I'll leave," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "if that's what you want." Clara stared at him, torn between fury and sadness. Part of her wanted to scream at him to go, to disappear from her life forever. But another part, the part that had grown to care for him, knew that losing him would leave a void she wasn't ready to face. "No," she said after a long pause. The days that followed Jack's confession were tense and heavy, like the air before a storm. Clara avoided him as much as possible, throwing herself into her work on the ranch to avoid thinking about what she'd learned. Every time she passed him in the barn or saw him fixing something outside, her stomach twisted with conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, but also an undeniable sense of gratitude. She didn't know how to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the reality of who he was. Someone powerful, wealthy, and capable of changing her life with a single decision. Jack, for his part, gave her space. He worked quietly, keeping his distance while still doing everything he could to help around the ranch. He mended fences, repaired machinery, and even started clearing out overgrown brush near the creek, tasks that needed doing but weren't urgent enough for Clara to demand his presence. Yet no matter how hard he tried to stay busy, his mind kept returning to their last conversation. Her words echoed in his head. "You meddled in my life without telling me the truth." He couldn't blame her for being upset. He'd crossed a line, and now he had to find a way to make things right, if that was even possible. One morning, as Clara sat on the porch sipping coffee, she noticed a sleek black car pulling up the dirt road toward the ranch. It wasn't a vehicle she recognized, and its polished exterior looked completely out of place against the rugged landscape. Her heart sank as she realized it was likely connected to the investor who'd been circling the area lately, a man named Victor Langston. Word had spread quickly through town that Langston was buying up failing properties at bargain prices, turning them into profitable ventures for himself, while displacing families and small businesses. Clara had hoped to avoid dealing with him directly, but here he was, stepping out of his car with a smug smile plastered across his face. "Ms. Bennett," Langston said smoothly, tipping his expensive hat. "I trust you're well?" Clara stood, forcing herself to appear calm despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Mr. Langston, what brings you out here?" Langston gestured vaguely at the surrounding land. "This beautiful property, of course. I understand you've been struggling financially, and I'd hate to see such prime real estate go to waste. Let's just say I'm in a position to offer you a generous solution." Clara clenched her fists behind her back. She'd heard stories about Langston's tactics, how he preyed on desperate people, pressuring them into selling their land at fractions of its true value. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Langston, but this ranch isn't for sale." Langston chuckled, as if her refusal amused him. Ah, yes, the stubborn spirit of the independent rancher. Admirable, really. But let's be honest, you're barely staying afloat as it is. With mounting debts and limited resources, how long do you think you can hold on? Why not let me take this burden off your hands? You'll walk away with more money than you've seen in years. His words stung because they were true, or at least partially so. Clara's financial situation was dire, and Langston clearly knew it. Still, she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "My answer is no, Mr. Langston. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Langston's smile faded slightly, replaced by a cold glint in his eyes. "Very well. For now. But remember, Ms. Bennett, opportunities like this don't come around often, and when they pass—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air before turning back to his car. Clara watched him drive away, her hands trembling with suppressed rage. She hated feeling powerless, especially when it came to protecting her home. As she turned to go back inside, she spotted Jack standing near the barn, watching her with concern etched on his face. Their eyes met briefly, but neither spoke. Clara walked past him without a word, though the weight of his gaze lingered long after she disappeared into the house. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack approached Clara where she sat alone in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of tea. He hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she wanted company, but decided to risk it anyway. "Clara," he began softly, "can we talk?" She glanced up, her expression guarded. "About what?" "About Langston. About everything." Clara sighed, setting her mug down with a sharp click. "What's there to talk about? You already lied to me once. Why should I believe anything you say now?" Jack flinched at the accusation but nodded. "Fair enough, but hear me out, okay? I may not have been honest with you from the start, but I never intended to hurt you. Everything I've done has been to protect you and this ranch." Clara crossed her arms over her chest. "Protect me? By lying? By hiding who you really are?" "Yes," Jack admitted, his voice firm despite the shame in his eyes. "Because I knew you wouldn't trust me if you found out the truth. And maybe I was wrong to keep it from you. I see that now, but I couldn't stand by and watch you lose everything." Clara stared at him, searching for any sign of insincerity. His words rang true, but they didn't erase the sting of betrayal. "So what happens next?" she asked finally. "Are you going to swoop in and save me again, buy my debt, and turn me into one of your projects?" "No," Jack said quickly. "That's not what I want. I want to help you keep this ranch. Not control it. But Clara, you need to understand something. Langston isn't just some random businessman looking for a good deal. He's ruthless, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants. If we don't act soon, he'll find a way to force you out." "And what exactly are we supposed to do?" Clara snapped, frustration bubbling over. "Fight him. With what? We're outnumbered and outgunned, Jack." Jack leaned forward, his tone urgent. "Not if we play smart. I own half the land surrounding this town, including the parcels Langston wants most. If I step in, I can block his plans. He won't dare." "Challenge me," Clara blinked, taken aback. "You'd do that? Risk your own interest to protect mine?" Jack met her gaze steadily. "Yes. Because this ranch matters to you. And, well, so do you." His admission caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to lash out, to remind him that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But another part of her softened at the sincerity in his voice. She'd spent so long fighting battles alone that the idea of having someone genuinely on her side felt almost foreign. Still, she couldn't ignore the hurdles ahead. "Even if you stop Langston," she said slowly, "what happens after that? You'll still be you, and I'll still be me. How does this end, Jack?" He hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know I can't walk away. Not now. Not when you need me. Clara studied him silently, weighing her options. She could push him away, sever ties completely, and try to handle Langston on her own. Or she could accept his help, knowing full well that it came with complications. Neither choice was ideal, but deep down, she knew which path offered the best chance of saving the ranch, and maybe salvaging what remained of their fragile relationship. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We'll do it your way for now. But if you lie to me again, Jack, I swear I'll never forgive you." Relief washed over Jack's face, though he didn't allow himself to relax entirely. "You won't regret this, Clara. I promise." Over the next few days, Jack sprang into action. Using his vast network of contacts, he orchestrated a series of legal maneuvers designed to thwart Langston's plans. He filed paperwork claiming ownership of key parcels adjacent to Clara's property, effectively boxing Langston out of the area. When Langston attempted to negotiate directly with Jack, expecting a quick resolution, Jack politely declined, citing personal reasons for refusing to sell. Word of the standoff spread quickly through town, sparking whispers and speculation. Some praised Jack for standing up to Langston while others questioned his motives. Mrs. Harper, ever the gossip monger, cornered Clara at the market one afternoon. "Heard your mysterious cowboy friend is causing quite the stir," she said, her tone laced with curiosity. "Care to explain why someone like Jack Callahan would go to such lengths for a little ranch like yours?" Clara bristled at the insinuation but forced herself to remain composed. "Jack's reasons are his own," she replied coolly. "All I care about is protecting my home." Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, clearly unsatisfied with the vague response. Clara ignored her probing stare and hurried home, eager to put the encounter behind her. As the dust settled and Langston reluctantly withdrew his offer, Clara allowed herself a rare moment of relief. The immediate threat had passed, thanks largely to Jack's intervention, but the underlying tension between them remained unresolved. They worked side by side during the day, maintaining a polite but distant rapport, yet the evenings were filled with awkward silences and unspoken questions. One night, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars, Clara broke the quiet. "Why did you really stay, Jack? After everything that happened, why didn't you just leave?" Jack sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because walking away would have meant giving up, not just on you but on myself. I've spent years running from my past, pretending I didn't care about anything or anyone, but meeting you, it reminded me that there's still good in the world worth fighting for." Clara listened intently, her heart softening despite her lingering doubts. "Do you think we can fix this?" she asked quietly. "Us, I mean." Jack smiled faintly, reaching out. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act for Clara and Jack. On the surface, things seemed to return to normal, or as close to normal as they could be after everything that had happened. They worked side by side during the day, tending to the ranch and keeping it running smoothly. But beneath the routine of chores and repairs, an unspoken tension lingered between them. It wasn't hostility exactly, but something quieter, more complicated, a mix of hurt, uncertainty, and cautious hope. Jack did his best to give Clara space, sensing that she needed time to process everything. He didn't push her to talk or make any demands about their relationship. Instead, he focused on proving himself through actions rather than words. If a fence needed fixing, he was there with tools in hand. If the cattle wandered too far into the hills, he saddled his horse without being asked. His presence was steady and reliable, a quiet reminder that he wasn't going anywhere, even if Clara still struggled to fully trust him. For Clara, the challenge lay in reconciling the man she'd come to care for with the reality of who he truly was. She couldn't deny that Jack had saved her ranch, not just from foreclosure but also from Langston's predatory schemes. Yet every time she looked at him, she saw not just the humble cowboy who'd mended her roof and shared her meals, but also the wealthy landowner who'd kept secrets from her. The duality of his identity confused her, making it hard to know how to feel. One afternoon, while Jack was out checking on the herd, Clara decided to take a drive into town. She hadn't been there much lately, choosing instead to stay close to the ranch and avoid prying eyes. But today she felt restless, like she needed a change of scenery. As she parked her truck near the general store, she noticed Mrs. Harper waving her over enthusiastically. "Clara, dear." "Just the person I wanted to see," Mrs. Harper chirped, her sharp eyes gleaming with curiosity. "How are things out at the ranch? Still surviving that handsome drifter of yours?" Clara forced a polite smile, though the question rankled. "Things are fine, Mrs. Harper. Jack's been helping a lot." Mrs. Harper tilted her head, clearly unsatisfied with the vague answer. "Helping, you say? Well, isn't that interesting? Folks around here have been talking, you know, about him and about you. Seems like your Mr. Callahan is quite the mysterious character." Clara sighed inwardly, bracing herself for what was coming next. Gossip was practically a sport in this town, and Mrs. Harper was its reigning champion. "What exactly are people saying?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, all sorts of things," Mrs. Harper replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Some say he's a secret millionaire hiding out in plain sight. Others think he might be involved in some kind of shady business dealings. Personally, I'm inclined to believe both." Clara resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "Jack's complicated," she admitted carefully. "But he's not what everyone thinks." Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow. "Isn't he, though? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he swooped in, fixed your problems, and now owns half the county. Sounds pretty convenient, doesn't it?" Her words struck a nerve, even though Clara knew Mrs. Harper meant no harm. Convenient. That was exactly how it felt sometimes, as if Jack had orchestrated everything perfectly, leaving her indebted to him without giving her a real choice. But deep down, Clara knew it wasn't that simple. Jack had risked his own interest to protect hers, and despite his mistakes, his intentions had always been good. "I don't expect you to understand," Clara said firmly, cutting off further speculation. "But Jack's done more for me than anyone else ever has. And yes, he made mistakes, but so have I. We're figuring things out." Mrs. Harper blinked, momentarily taken aback by Clara's rare display of defiance. Then she smiled thinly. "Well, aren't you two just a regular soap opera? All I'll say is, be careful, dear. Men like that, they come with baggage." Clara nodded politely and excused herself, heading into the store before the conversation could go any further. As she browsed the aisles, her mind raced. Mrs. Harper's comments had planted seeds of doubt again, reminding her of all the unanswered questions she still had about Jack. Who was he, really? What drove him to live this double life? And why had he chosen her ranch as the place to settle, for however long he planned to stay? Determined to find answers, Clara returned home and waited until evening, when Jack came back from the fields. She found him sitting on the porch steps, idly sharpening a pocket knife. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the horizon, and for a moment, Clara simply stood there watching him. Despite everything, there was something undeniably comforting about his presence. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, sitting down beside him. Jack glanced up, his expression wary but open. "Of course." Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Why did you choose this life? You could have stayed wherever you came from, lived comfortably, surrounded by people who knew who you were. Why pretend to be someone else?" Jack set the knife aside and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For a long moment he stared at the ground as if gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. "After my wife passed away," he began slowly, "I couldn't stand the thought of staying in one place. Everywhere I went reminded me of her, the house we lived in, the streets we walked, the friends we used to laugh with. So I left. I sold most of what we owned and started traveling, hoping to outrun the pain." He paused, swallowing hard. "At first it worked. Being anonymous gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. No one expected anything from me. No one judged me for failing to move on. I liked that. Liked being invisible. But eventually, I realized I was just running away. From grief, from responsibility, from myself. Clara listened intently, her heart aching for the man beside her. She'd known he carried sadness, but hearing him speak so openly about it brought a new depth to her understanding of him. "So why stop here?" she asked gently. "Why my ranch?" Jack turned to look at her, his blue eyes filled with emotion. "Because of you, Clara. When I first saw you working so hard to keep this place together despite everything stacked against you, I saw someone worth staying for. Someone who reminded me that life doesn't have to be about running. It can be about building something meaningful again." His honesty caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. Here was the man she'd doubted, the man she'd accused of manipulation, and yet, in this moment, he was laying bare his soul, trusting her with his truth. "Not perfect," Jack continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I've made mistakes, and I'll probably make more, but I want to make things right. With you, with this ranch, with myself. If you'll let me." Clara felt tears welling up, though she fought to hold them back. She'd spent so long guarding her heart, afraid of letting anyone get too close. But now, faced with Jack's raw sincerity, she realized she couldn't keep pushing him away, not when he was willing to fight for her. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted softly. "But I do know I can't do this alone anymore. And maybe I don't want to." Jack reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt a flicker of peace. They sat there together as the sky darkened, neither speaking, content simply to share the silence. Over the following days, Clara began to piece together more of Jack's story, not from him directly, but from others in town who had heard whispers of his past. She learned about his late wife, Sarah, and how they'd built a successful business empire together before tragedy struck. She discovered that Jack had quietly funded schools, hospitals, and community projects under pseudonyms, preferring to remain unseen while helping those in need. Slowly, she began to see him not as a secretive billionaire, but as a man burdened by loss and guilt, trying to find redemption in small acts of kindness. With each revelation, Clara's resentment faded a little more, replaced by admiration and love. She still had questions, still moments of doubt, but she no longer feared the answers. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together. As autumn settled over the ranch, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Clara and Jack found a rhythm that worked for them. They talked openly about their fears, their dreams, and their hopes for the future. They laughed more, argued less, and gradually rebuilt the trust that had been broken. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, becoming not just a home, but a symbol of resilience and renewal. And though Jack never stopped being the enigmatic figure he'd always been, Clara came to accept that loving him meant embracing all parts of him, the humble cowboy, the generous benefactor, and the grieving widower. Together they proved that even the most unlikely pairings could create something extraordinary. The months rolled on, and the ranch transformed in ways Clara had never imagined possible. With Jack's resources and her vision, they turned the once struggling property into a thriving hub of activity. The old barn was repaired and repainted, its weathered wood gleaming under fresh coats of red paint. New irrigation systems were installed, ensuring the fields stayed lush even during dry spells. Cattle grazed contentedly in pastures that stretched farther than ever before, thanks to Jack quietly purchasing adjacent parcels of land and gifting them to Clara. But it wasn't just the physical changes that made the ranch feel different, it was the energy. Laughter echoed through the air again, replacing the tension and worry that had hung over the place for so long. Neighbors who used to pass by without stopping now came regularly, drawn by Clara's warm hospitality and Jack's quiet charm. They hosted barbecues under the stars where stories were shared, guitars played, and friendships deepened. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she belonged, not just to the land but to a community. Jack, too, seemed lighter. The weight he'd carried for so long, the guilt, the grief, the isolation, began to lift as he allowed himself to open up to Clara and the people around him. He still wore his cowboy hat low over his face when strangers approached, still preferred working behind the scenes rather than taking credit for his contributions. But those close to him saw the change, the way his smile reached his eyes more often, the ease with which he joked with Clara, the pride he took in watching the ranch flourish. One crisp morning, as frost clung to the grass and the sun peaked, over the hills, Clara stood at the edge of the property with Jack by her side. She looked out at the sprawling acres, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's hard to believe this is the same place," she said softly. Jack chuckled, leaning against the fence post. "It's still your ranch, Clara. I just gave it a little boost." She shook her head, smiling. "You did more than that. You saved it, and me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," Jack replied, his voice tinged with emotion. "By letting me be part of your life. By trusting me again." Clara glanced at him, her chest tightening with affection. It amazed her how far they'd come since their rocky start. What began as mistrust and suspicion had grown into something solid and enduring, a partnership built on honesty, forgiveness, and love. She slipped her hand into his, intertwining their fingers. "We're going to make this work, aren't we?" Jack squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "Yeah, we are." Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, times when old wounds threatened to resurface, but they faced them together, talking openly and reminding each other why they mattered. Clara learned to see beyond Jack's wealth and influence, focusing instead on the man beneath, the one who cared deeply, worked tirelessly, and loved fiercely. And Jack in turn embraced the vulnerability it took to let someone in, knowing that loving Clara meant sharing not just his successes, but also his struggles. As winter approached, bringing snowflakes that dusted the fields like powdered sugar, Clara decided to host a holiday gathering at the ranch. It was her way of thanking everyone who'd supported her over the past year, from neighbors who lent a helping hand to Jack, whose presence had changed everything. Tables were set up in the barn, adorned with handmade decorations and candles, flickering warmly against the cold night. The scent of roasted meats and freshly baked pies filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and music. During the celebration, Mrs. Harper cornered Clara near the dessert table, holding a plate, piled high with cookies. Well, she said, her tone teasing but kind. "Looks like you two finally sorted things out." Clara laughed, glancing across the room where Jack stood talking animatedly with a group of ranch hands. "I guess we did." Mrs. Harper nodded approvingly. "Good for you, dear. Never thought I'd say this, but that man of yours, he's got a good heart. Don't let him go." "I won't," Clara promised, her gaze lingering on Jack. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the cleanup was done, Clara and Jack sat together by the fireplace. The crackling flames cast a golden glow over the cozy living room, highlighting the contentment on their faces. Clara leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Your old life, I mean. All the traveling, the anonymity?" Jack considered the question, his brow furrowing slightly. "Sometimes. There's freedom in not being tied down, in starting fresh wherever you go. But..." He paused, looking down at her. "I've found something better here. Something real." Clara smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "Me too." They fell silent then, simply enjoying the quiet companionship. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a new season. Spring would come eventually, bringing growth and renewal, much like the journey Clara and Jack had embarked upon together. In the weeks that followed, they continued to dream big for the future. Clara envisioned expanding the ranch to include educational programs for local kids, teaching them about sustainable farming and animal care. Jack offered to fund the project, insisting that it align with her values rather than his own ambitions. Together they planned festivals and workshops, turning the ranch into a cornerstone of the community. Through it all, Jack remained humble, choosing to live modestly despite his vast wealth. He drove an old truck, wore worn boots, and slept in the same creaky bed frame he'd claimed months ago. To Clara, this simplicity was part of what made him special, a reminder that true worth wasn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in character and kindness. One spring afternoon, as wildflowers bloomed across the fields and the sky stretched endlessly blue above them, Clara and Jack stood together beneath the ancient oak tree at the center of the property. Jack held her hand tightly, his thumb brushing against hers as he spoke. "I never thought I'd find happiness again after Sarah," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But you've given me a second chance, Clara. A reason to keep going." Tears pricked Clara's eyes as she looked up at him. "And you've given me more than I ever dreamed possible. Not just this ranch, but hope, love, a future." Without another word, Jack pulled her close, kissing her gently, as the breeze rustled the leaves above them. In that moment, surrounded by the land they'd fought so hard to save, they knew they'd found something rare and precious, a love born of resilience, trust, and mutual respect. Life wouldn't always be easy. Challenges would undoubtedly arise. But as long as they faced them together, Clara and Jack believed they could overcome anything. Their story was proof that sometimes the most unexpected connections lead to the deepest bonds, and that love, no matter how complicated its beginnings, has the power to transform everything it touches.